Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. We're now beginning Chapter 1 of Fascism and Social Revolution by R.P. Dutt, and I just wanted to include a note that if you haven't listened to the previous file that's labeled Preface/Introduction, listen to that one first. It actually contains as much theory as any of the chapters do. In some cases, the introduction is just an introduction. In this case, I would not recommend skipping it. Alright, Chapter 1, Technique and Revolution. In the issue of the Automobile Engineer for March 1931 appeared an article on the machine tool, an analysis of the factors determining obsolescence. This article was not written as a criticism of existing society. It was written with considerable detail and statistical calculations to assist employers or their technical managers to determine under what conditions the installation of new high-production machinery can be profitable. Nevertheless, the conclusions reached were, in the highest degree, revolutionary. The first conclusion was to the effect that, quoting the words of a paper of Mr. H.C. Armitage to the Institute of Automobile Engineers, quote, "High production machines that are being developed in America cannot be economically used in this country," unquote. The reason given was, quote, "because existing British plants can already produce more rapidly than the products can be disposed of," comment, or sold, and this has been identified in Marxism as the main bottleneck in capitalism that holds back productivity. You can find it discussed even in the Manifesto or Principles of Communism. It's an overproduction crisis, and it's the basis of the business cycle, the boom and bust cycle. Capitalism has to stop production for a while in order that the already produced products can be consumed. During that waiting phase, people are thrown out of work and there's economic contraction. In socialism, in which production is for use and not profit, there isn't this constraint. Continuing the quote, "The statement has been made many times that American factories in the main industries could more than supply the world's needs, even if all other supply sources closed down," unquote. On this ground, objection was taken to the common complaint of, quote, "uninformed critics of British industry," unquote, that British employers had fallen behind in the race because of maintaining, quote, "hopelessly out-of-date factory equipment," unquote. On the contrary, in fact, the British capitalists knew very well what they were doing when they left their German and American rivals during the decade after the war to install gigantic modern equipment of large-scale production at heavy expense, requiring heavy maintenance costs and an enormous market. While they themselves preferred mainly to concentrate on speeding up and driving harder their labor on relatively older machinery, which required fewer maintenance costs and a smaller market. On this basis, they have been better able to meet the crisis than their German and American rivals. The second conclusion went even further and declared that this principle now applied also to American industry. Quote, "The time has now arrived when Mr. Armitage's remarks may be widened to a statement that the latest machine tools now being developed in America cannot even be economically used in the United States," unquote. That is to say, the most modern developments of technique can no longer be utilized in even the most advanced countries of capitalism. The third conclusion provides the complement to the first two. One market, it is pointed out, still remains for the most advanced machine tools. That market is the Soviet Union. Quote, "American machine tool makers, having a range of equipment sufficient to meet the needs of the American production plants, have supplied to Russia machine tools outside this range, specially designed to obtain still faster production. An excessive price has been demanded for these special machines on the ground that, while the tools show an improvement in output speed on their standard lines, they have no immediate prospects of finding other customers for them, there being no demand outside Russia for faster production than can be obtained with existing models," unquote. Thus, according to the testimony of this technical engineering journal, the most modern developments of technique, making possible the most extensive and rapid production with the minimum of labor, can no longer be utilized in the countries of capitalism, where they've originated, but can only be utilized today in the country of socialist construction, in the Soviet Union. The significance of this present stage of technique and society here revealed, and this example is only one of 10,000 constantly arising in every direction in the present period, requires no emphasis. Here, as in a single crystal, is expressed the whole present stage of the general crisis of capitalism, of the exhaustion of the possibilities of productive advance within the fetters of the old private property ownership, and the necessity of the socialization of production as the sole condition for further development. In the situation that this picture reveals lies the real root of the issue of fascism or communism. In this situation lies the basic cause why precisely at the present stage of social development, the issue of fascism or communism inescapably confronts existing society. Comment. So to sum up that introductory portion of Chapter 1, we catch up with the state of the world in the 1930s. While the American and German capitalists were attempting to push forward with improved productive techniques, the British capitalists were just hanging back, content to use older machinery and to drive their labor harder. Remember that the extraction of surplus value from labor is the only real source of profit. And for an explanation of that statement, see Marx's Value, Price, and Profit. We have it on the channel. But basically it means that the price of a worker working in a workplace is that they get paid for part of their labor and they also work free for part of the day. So just driving the labor harder so that you get more surplus value, that's how you keep your profits up. So by this point, technology was increasing rapidly, and the only market that could handle it was the Soviet Union, which was producing not for profit but for use. So they didn't have to worry about overproduction crises to protect prices and stuff like that. Being a society run by and for the benefit of the working class, the proletariat, their aim was not to keep prices or profits high. It was, in fact, the opposite. It was to overcome scarcity and to overcome a finite surplus, that, of course, being the basis of class society. I mentioned before the Communist Manifesto and the Principles of Communism, which is basically the manifesto written as a frequently asked questions file. And even in that early document, Marx and Engels pointed out that socialism would have to blow past capitalism in terms of its productive output because, again, it was having that infinite abundance, the ability to produce whatever they needed, that would be the basis of socialist production and socialist society. Capitalism, on the other hand, arises out of feudalism at a time when there is still natural scarcity. Capitalism then unleashes huge productive forces, which makes scarcity less and less of a thing. However, capitalism itself can never conquer that scarcity. Even after natural scarcity has been overcome, it must artificially find ways to maintain scarcity, or else it puts itself out of business. Workers who realize this can become class conscious and organized enough to end capitalism and initiate socialist construction. Continuing on. 1. The growth of the productive forces. A century ago, Robert Owen, on the basis of his experience as a successful manufacturer, noted the contradiction between the new social productive labor and the private appropriation of the fruits of it. Quote, "The working part of this population of 2,500 persons in New Lanark was daily producing as much real wealth for society as less than half a century before it would have required the working part of a population of 600,000 to create. I asked myself, what became of the difference between the wealth consumed by 2,500 persons and that which would have been consumed by 600,000? Unquote. That's quoting from Owen's The Revolution in the Mind and Practice of the Human Race, 1849. The contradiction of capitalism was thus already clearly seen by Owen on the basis of his conduct of the model factory of New Lanark from 1800 to 1829. But the criticism remained an idealist one. For capitalism in this period, despite all the cruelty and poverty involved in its process, was still ascending. It was still able to organize and develop the productive forces. It was still a progressive factor, carrying through the transformation from wasteful and uneconomic small-scale production to modern, large-scale production, and thus preparing the material basis for the future society. The critique of capitalism in this period by Owen and others remained utopian. Comment: for more on that particular point, see Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. Continuing, the answer to this type of critique of capitalism was provided by Marx in his discussion of a similar line of argument of Proudhon. Quote, "In 1770, the population of the United Kingdom of Great Britain was 15 millions, and the productive population 3 millions. The scientific power of production would about equal a population of 12 more millions, thus making a total of 15 millions of productive forces. Thus, the productive power was to the population as 1:1, and the scientific power was to manual power as 4:1. In 1840, the population did not exceed 30 millions. The productive population was 6 millions, while the scientific power amounted to 650 millions. That is to say, it was to the whole population as 21:1, and to manual power as 108:1. In English society, the day of labor had thus acquired, in 70 years, a surplus of 2,700% of productivity. That is to say that in 1840, it produced 27 times as much as in 1770. According to M. Proudhon, it is necessary to put the following question: why is the English workman of 1840 not 27 times richer than the workman of 1770? In putting such a question, one would naturally suppose that the English had been able to produce these riches without the historical conditions in which they were produced, such as the private accumulation of capital, the modern division of labor, the automatic workshop, anarchic competition, the wage system, and, in fine, all that which is based upon the antagonism of classes having to exist. But these were precisely the necessary conditions for the development of the productive forces and of the surplus of labor. Thus it was necessary, in order to obtain this development of the productive forces and this surplus of labor, that there should be some classes which thrive and others which perish." Unquote. That's from The Poverty of Philosophy. This basic conception of the capacity of development of the productive forces as the measure of a progressive or reactionary social order is no less strongly expressed in Marx's praise of Ricardo. Quote, "The reproach moved against him that he has an eye only to the development of the productive forces regardless of, quote, human beings, regardless of the sacrifice in human beings and capital values incurred, strikes precisely his strong point. The development of the productive forces of social labor is the historical task and privilege of capital. It is precisely in this way that it unconsciously creates the material requirements of a higher mode of production." Unquote. That's from Capital, Volume 3. The Marxist critique of capitalism thus basically differs from the utopian school still surviving in the so-called English socialism. The Marxist critique recognizes the historical role of capitalism in the development of the productive forces. But the Marxist critique laid bare, already nearly a century ago, when no other economists or thinkers had the slightest glimmering of the future line of development, that the inner laws of capitalist development would inevitably lead to a stage at which capitalism could no longer organize the productive forces, but could only result in successively more violent crises, stagnation and decay, and at which only the new social class, the proletariat, freed from the limitations of private property, could alone organize the social productive forces to a higher level. This is the heart of Marxism, whose political expression is the dictatorship of the proletariat as the necessary condition of the solutions of the problems of the present epoch. It is this culminating stage of capitalism that we are at present living through, the stage of imperialism, or capitalism in decay, and more particularly now since 1914, World War I, the stage of the general crisis of capitalism, or final phase within imperialism, when the forces of production are in ever more violent conflict with the cramping fetters of the existing property relations of production, when capitalism, in more and more obvious decay, is faced with the advance of victory of the proletarian social revolution, and when capitalism in decay is resorting to every device and expedient to maintain its power. Let us note first the gigantic growth of the productive forces since the early criticisms of a century ago. The following table gives the growth of industrial machine power, omitting motor transport power in the past century, in millions of horsepower. 1 horsepower is commonly calculated as equivalent to the muscular power of 6 men. And there's a chart here titled Growth of Industrial Machine Power in Million Horsepower. I'll put it on the screen. It tracks the United Kingdom, France, Germany, USA, other countries, and the world in 4 time snapshots: 1835, 1875, 1913, and 1928. And there's huge growth. For example, the UK goes from 0.3 to 6 to 28.5 to 37. The world overall goes from 0.65 to 26.5 to 211 to 390. And this is originally from Hausleiter, published in English under the title The Machine Unchained, 1933. Continuing. A century ago, we have seen it was already complained that productive power had increased 27 times over in England in the previous 70 years without any corresponding improvement in the standards of the workers. But in the century since 1835, industrial machine power multiplied a further 100 times over in England and 600 times over in the whole world, and has ended in mass starvation and unemployment without equal. Comment here, this was written in 1935. A similar thing happened when computer technology was developed. From the 1970s on, there were further huge leaps forward in productivity, yet wages stagnated. Continuing, in the decade and a half alone between 1913 and 1928, industrial machine power in Europe has increased 50%, in the United States 100%, and in the extra-European countries other than the US 200%. The inclusion of all forms of power would bring the world total to something like 1,500 million horsepower. On this basis, Stuart Chase in his Machines and Men, published 1929, has estimated the machine power of the world as representing the muscular power of 9,000 million or 9 billion additional men, or equivalent to 5 slaves for every man, woman, and child of the human race. Between 1913 and 1927, electrical power production, according to the Report on Power Resources of the World, presented to the World Power Conference in 1930, increased from 47 billion units to 200 billion units. Between the First and Second World Power Conferences in 1924 and 1930, electrical output doubled from 150 billion units to 300 billion units. This expansion of productive power has most strongly affected manufacturing industry, but it has also affected agriculture and the output of raw materials, not in equal degree, but far outstripping the growth of human population. Already by 1890, according to Hausleiter, the costs of agricultural production in the Great Grain Circle, United States, Canada, Argentina, Australia, had been reduced by mechanization to 1/4 of the costs of the old production by hand labor in 1830. Between 1890 and 1921, according to the report of the Senior Trade Commissioner in Canada for May 1930, further mechanization of agriculture and extension of the area of cultivation had multiplied the yield of wheat per agricultural worker 5-fold. Quote, Mr. Field lays great stress on the rapidity with which power-driven machinery is displacing labor in Canadian agriculture. Whereas in 1890, 13.5 bushels of wheat were grown for each rural dweller, there were 70 in 1921. And as the most revolutionary machine, the combined reaper and thresher, was only introduced in 1924, the output per worker must now be a great deal higher. Moreover, the scope for the mechanization of agriculture has by no means yet been fully exploited. Unquote, Economist, September 8, 1930. Between 1920 and 1929, the number of tractors in the United States increased from 246,000 to 843,000, according to the U.S. Yearbook of Agriculture, 1930. Between 1900 and 1924 to 28, the harvests of all cereals increased in Australia 104%, in the Argentine 172%, and in Canada 330%. Between 1913 and 1928, the volume of world grain exports increased 147%. In the same period, world population increased only 11.6%. The old, ignorant Malthusian notions of absolute overpopulation, or the modern lugubrious chants of birth control as the necessary solution of poverty, are thus abundantly exploded by facts. It is worth noting that this reactionary propaganda is still maintained not only in clerical and conservative quarters, but also by the would-be progressive, actually, as we shall have occasion to see, one of the real bulwarks of conservatism in England, Labour Party. Comment here, that's not to say that communists are opposed to birth control in the sense of people only creating children where and when they want to create children. This is in opposition to a line that you hear a lot of the time that, we have to restrict the birth rate in certain countries, usually populated by people of color, or those populations within, quote, our own countries, because, quote, they're just having too many children and it's breeding poverty, etc. This is a racist argument. In a socialist world, this isn't a problem. These are artifacts of capitalism. For example, today, some of the megacities around the world have truly horrific conditions. But why did people come to them in the first place? In search of work, because of the ways that capitalism had changed that country's economy. Socialism can straighten all of that out. Continuing, the English Labour Party's official organ writes, quote, "The figures published by the League of Nations," comment the predecessor of the United Nations, "shows that the world population, already 2 billion, is increasing by 20 million a year. That means that unless the rate of increase is checked, it will have doubled in far less than a century, for the increase is, as it were, at compound interest. There is not the least reason for assuming that the march of progress will automatically provide ways and means of feeding and supporting that doubled population. There is only too much evidence, in India and China for example, that the overcrowding of a too big population brings with it appalling conditions of misery, either an unendurable suffering or the, quote, natural checks of famine and pestilence and a high death rate, or, on the other hand, a deliberate and conscious lowering and controlling of the birth rate. Those are the alternatives that face humanity," unquote, Daily Herald editorial, August 8, 1932. Fortunately, these are not the alternatives that confront humanity today. The alternatives that confront humanity today are serious enough, but they are alternatives of the destruction and anarchy of capitalism, involving still greater poverty and misery in the midst of abundance and rising productive power, or the social organization of production, bringing abundance for all. The, quote, overpopulation, like the simultaneous overproduction, is only relative to the capitalist conditions of production. Against this reactionary and vicious propaganda, concealing under cover of obsolete clerical superstitions the true social causes of poverty and misery, concealing also, characteristically enough, the role of imperialism in India in creating poverty, may be quoted the opinion of the leading international statistician, Sir George Nibs, who estimated that even with present resources and technique, the Earth could easily maintain 4 times the present population at a good standard. Quote, "The late Sir George Nibs estimated after a careful survey that the Earth could well support a population 4 times as great as at present, or about 8,000 million, 8 billion, unquote. The facts of the crisis show a very different picture to the cant of overpopulation outstripping natural resources. Already by 1925, according to the reports presented to the 1927 International Economic Conference at Geneva, despite the destruction of the World War, world production of foodstuffs and raw materials had risen over the pre-war levels by 16 to 18%, against an estimated increase of population of 5%. Between 1913 and 1928, according to the League of Nations Economic Section, world production of foodstuffs and raw materials had increased by 25%, of foodstuffs by 16%, and of raw materials by 40%, of industrial products enormously more, against an estimated increase of world population by 10%. World stocks of primary products on the basis of 1923 to 5 as 100 increased by the end of 1926 to 134, by 1928 to 161, by 1929 to 192, by 1930 to 235, by 1931 to 264, and by the end of 1932, despite all the destruction of stocks, still stood at 263, or more than 2.5 times the volume of 8 years before. World stocks of manufacturers showed a less overwhelming accumulation only because, quote, the existence of a large volume of unemployed but immediately available factors of production, unquote, has the same effect in the sphere of manufactures, quote, corresponding to that exercised by enormous stocks of primary products, unquote. The growth of production in every direction, whether of foodstuffs, raw materials, or manufactures, has thus greatly exceeded the growth of world population, and the increase of productive power, which has only been partially and incompletely used under capitalist conditions, with many artificial limitations and restrictions, has been in reality enormously greater than the actual growth of production. But this gigantic increase of productive power has outstripped the capacity of capitalism to organize it. The outcome of this gigantic increase of productive power has been world crisis, stagnation and closing down of production, mass unemployment, mass impoverishment, and the lowering of standards on a scale without parallel since the beginning of capitalism, accompanied by growing social and political disturbance and recurrent war. This problem is the basic problem confronting present-day society. 2. The conflict of the productive forces against existing society. This is the world situation which reveals that the system of capitalist relations, The capitalist class ownership of the means of production has outlived its progressive role and has become a fetter on the organization of production. The World War was the beginning of the violent explosion of this conflict, of the conflict between the ever-growing productive forces and the limits of existing property society. Since 1914, we've entered into a new era, the era of the general crisis of capitalism and of the advance of the world socialist revolution. The world economic crisis, which opened in 1929, has brought these issues of the present stage of society and of the basic economic contradictions underlying them more sharply to the general consciousness than ever before. But the significance of this world economic crisis is commonly seen through two narrow spectacles. It is seen as a special, temporary disorganization breaking in on an otherwise harmonious and smoothly working economic mechanism. Alike in the pessimistic and the optimistic readings of its significance, the proportions have tended to be lost. Just as the extreme low depths of a depression produced almost universal utterances of pessimism and apocalyptic gloom from the leaders and professors of capitalism, so the first signs of an upward movement produced a universal sigh of relief and reprieve, as if the worst were over and all might yet be well again. In fact, the devil was sick. But the real significance of the world economic crisis, which has so greatly exceeded in its scope all previous economic crises, can only be correctly understood in relation to the whole development of capitalism, and in particular the development of capitalism during the last 2 decades. That is, in relation to the general crisis of capitalism, which opened in 1914. The general crisis of capitalism should not be confused with the old cyclical crises of capitalism, which, although demonstrating the inherent contradictions of capitalist relations, nevertheless constituted an integral part and direct factor in the ascent of capitalism. The cyclical crises, as illustrated in 1920 and 21 and 1929, continue, but they take on a new and intensified character in the period of the general crisis. The old cyclical crises were, according to Marx, quote, always but momentary and forcible solutions of the existing contradictions, violent eruptions, which restored the disturbed equilibrium for a while, quoting Capital, Volume 3. Their characteristic feature was to solve the contradictions, albeit by anarchically violent and destructive means, to restore the equilibrium, and permit of the resumption of production on a higher plane. They weeded out the smaller and less efficient concerns. They wiped out a portion of capital values in order to save the remainder. They effected a concentration of capital. They compelled a drive to open up new markets. On this basis, they permitted, after a relatively short period, the resumption of capitalist production at a higher level. Elements of this character can also be traced in the post-war world economic crisis, but these, quote, progressive elements are overshadowed by the major negative effects of the whole process of the development of the cyclical crisis on the basis of the general crisis of capitalism, in the consequent destruction of stabilization and hastening of revolutionizing processes. The domination of the imperialist powers has already been expanded to its maximum extent throughout the world. Monopoly capitalism, which had already divided up the greater part of the world by the beginning of the 20th century, and by 1914 was at war over its redivision, is now faced with a still sharper situation of contradictions, not only between the imperialist powers, but also between imperialism and socialism. So far from there being available new regions to open up, 1/6 of the world has passed out of the sphere of capitalism into that of the social revolution. The colonial peoples are rising in revolt. The world available for capitalist exploitation has begun to contract. At the same time, the growth of productive power is greater than ever. The extreme crisis, competition, and war forcing forward technical development and the process of capitalist rationalization. Under these conditions, there is no room for a harmonious solution, but only for ever more violent conflict. The upward movements within the general crisis become ever shorter. Depression becomes the norm, broken by short upward movements and violent social and political explosions. The recurrence of the old cyclical crisis within the general crisis takes on a new intensity. The general crisis of capitalism has now continued for 20 years without a break, only changing one form for another. The violent explosion of the World War only gave place to the still more profound struggle of revolution and counter-revolution throughout the world. The defeat of the revolution in the countries outside the Soviet Union brought no solution and peaceful development, but only laid bare the post-war chaos of capitalism. The temporary stabilization and upward movement of the middle 20s proved only a false and illusory stabilization. Quote, the prosperity of the period 1923 to 29 was to a large extent illusory, and the seeds of future trouble had already been sown, to quote the British government note to the U.S., December 1st, 1932. Its only outcome was the new form of the basic contradiction expressed in the extreme world economic crisis, which began in 1929 and continues now in its fifth year. This, in its turn, breaks out into new and violent explosions in the spread of fascism and the visibly approaching Second World War. Already in the closing years of his life, Engels noted the approach of a new era. Quote, there is now no doubt that the position has fundamentally changed by comparison with formerly. We have entered upon a period much more dangerous for the old society than that of the 10-year cycles, meaning the business cycle. The crises become chronic. Quoting Engels' letter to Babel, January 20, 1886. In 1909, Kautsky, writing then as a Marxist theorist in his Path to Power, exposed the revisionist illusions of gradual and peaceful progress, and demonstrated the now close entry of capitalism into a period of violent explosions. In 1916, Lenin, in his Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, laid bare the foundations of the new period as the period of monopoly capitalism, in which all the contradictions come to a head, of decaying capitalism, of the eve of the socialist revolution, the period which broke into violent explosion in 1914. Up to 1913, capitalist production, despite the increasing tendencies of decay already visible in imperialism, was still able to maintain an almost continuous ascending line. Quoting the League of Nations World Economic Survey 1932-33, for many decades before the war, world production, according to the best estimates available, increased with remarkable regularity of the trend, broken only in minor degree by successive crises. This trend of increase ran through both the period of declining prices from 1873 to 1895 and the period of rising prices from 1895 onwards, unquote. Between 1860 and 1913, according to the tables presented in this publication, world production of basic commodities ascended in an almost continuous line and multiplied from 4 to 5 times. World industrial production ascended in an almost continuous line and multiplied over 6 times. But the 20 years since 1914 reveal a different picture. Quoting the same publication, if the line of trend from 1860 to 1913 is extended to 1932, the rather startling conclusion is reached that the index of world production, on the hypothesis that nothing had occurred to alter its regular upward trend for the 50 preceding years, would today be rather more than twice as great as it actually is, unquote. The present world economic crisis is without precedent. Quoting the same publication again, there is no precedent for such a marked decline. Statistical series ranging back to 1860 fail to reveal any previous period in which the decline in either raw material production or manufactures has been so precipitate or so severe. Independent estimates agree that in 1932, the level of industrial production in the world as a whole fell below that of 1913, unquote. Thus, the war and post-war period, taken as a whole, reveals the first large-scale absolute setback of capitalist production. The attempt is often made, on the basis of the above facts and figures, to argue that since 1914 appears as the great dividing point, therefore, the war is the cause of all the present maladies. Comparisons are sometimes made to the post-Napoleonic period of unsettlement, revolutionary unrest, and the Industrial Revolution, and the inference is drawn that the troubles of the present period are also troubles of post-war unsettlement and of the, quote, Second Industrial Revolution, heralding a no less great expansion within the forms of capitalism. This very superficial approach to the real historical movement of two entirely different periods and to the crux of modern world problems is demonstrably incorrect both in fact and in reasoning. In the first place, no comparison is possible between the post-Napoleonic period of young and ascending capitalism and the 20th century period of old and declining capitalism. 15 years after the Napoleonic Wars, production, trade, and employment were gigantically above the pre-war level. Capitalist society was bounding forward. 15 years after the war of 1914 to 18, production, trade, and employment are actually below the pre-war level. Capitalist society is in a greater dilemma than ever, greater than even in the period succeeding the war. The dislocation instead of diminishing as the war recedes, actually increases. It is greater 15 years after the war than it was 10 years after the war. It is obvious that some deeper factor is at work than the disturbances consequent on the war. At the same time, the social and political issues of the two periods are basically different. The issue of the first half of the 19th century was still the issue of the bourgeois or capitalist revolution, which swept forward through the processes of the Napoleonic Wars and after, despite the seeming victories of reaction. The issue of the first half of the 20th century is the issue of the proletarian social revolution, which began its advance in the conditions of the War of 1914-18, and which maintains its growing strength in the midst of the capitalist reaction. In the second place, it is not correct that the division between before 1914 and after 1914 is a simple and absolute division between the ascent and the descent of the level of production. On the contrary, the actual level of production in 1927-9 was for the short period of the boom higher than the pre-war level. The real growth of the contradictions, which was to find expression in the subsequent slump falling below the pre-war level, lay elsewhere. The true measure of the decline and bankruptcy of the existing capitalist order lies, not in any simple arithmetical figures of the level of production, but in the growth of the contradictions of the existing society to bursting point, in the growth of the contradiction between the potential productive power and the actual production, between the conditions of existence of the bourgeoisie and of the proletariat, between the rival imperialist powers, and the consequent expression of these in social and political explosions. It is in this sense that the general crisis of capitalism dates from 1914, but its causes lie in the whole conditions of the imperialist epoch. Finally, and in consequence of the above, the World War of 1914-18, so far from being the cause of the crisis of capitalism, was on the contrary itself only an expression and breaking out of the crisis, a link in the chain of imperialist development. The war was no arbitrary, accidental, unforeseeable first cause, suddenly breaking in from nowhere to change the whole course of development. It was the direct consequence of the conditions of imperialism, which was itself the direct outcome of the previous 19th century capitalist epoch. It was fully foreseen, and even predicted in detail for years beforehand, as the outcome of the growing tensions of imperialism. Its outbreak coincided with the gathering industrial crisis, which was already beginning in America in 1913 and spreading therefrom to hover menacingly over Europe. As the war leader Lloyd George confessed nearly 20 years after, the war appeared as the way out from the gathering crisis, which he is now convinced would not have in any case developed, even had the war not broken out at that point. Quoting his speech at Cambridge in the Manchester Guardian Weekly, April 1933, "If we had not had a great war, if we had gone on as we were going, I am sure that sooner or later we would have been confronted with something approximately like the present chaos. There must be something fundamentally wrong with our economic system, because abundance produces scarcity." Unquote. The fact that the dynamic of capitalist development, even after the direct destruction caused by the First World War has been repaired, only reverts to the recurrence of still more gigantic economic crisis and the visible approach to a Second World War, shows how little of accident there was in the basic development of capitalism through imperialism to world war, however large the role of accident may appear to be in the particular historical manifestations of the process. In order to understand the problems of the present epoch of the general crisis of capitalism, it is essential to be able to see deeper than the immediate surface manifestations and episodes, whether of the World War of 1914 or of the world economic crisis of 1929, and to understand these in relation to the general line of development, of which they are expressions. The general crisis of capitalism, the conflict of the productive forces against the existing relations of production, expresses itself in a whole series of successively growing conflicts and explosions, up to the final victory of the proletarian social revolution. It is in relation to this development of the general crisis of capitalism that fascism is a further stage and episode. 3. Productivity and unemployment. The development of the productive forces has rendered the old class society obsolete. Already before the end of the war, the leading trust magnate, Lord Leverhulme, estimated that if the then existing productivity were organized, 1 hour's work per week of all citizens would provide the necessities of life for all. quoting from his preface to Professor Spencer's Wealth from Waste, 1918, "With the means that science has already placed at our disposal, we might provide for all the wants of each of us in food, shelter, and clothing by 1 hour's work per week for each of us from school age to dotage." Unquote. That was 15 years ago. In the intervening decade and a half, according to the engineer J.L. Hodgson, in his paper on industrial and communal waste before the Royal Society of Arts on June 20, 1932, in the course of which he quoted and accepted Lord Leverhulme's statement, quote, "Since that date, our average potential productivity has nearly doubled." Unquote. 1/2 hour's work per week should thus provide a minimum standard for all, and 1 hour's work per week an overwhelming abundance. Why should this almost immeasurable increase in productive power and the possibility of universal abundance result in universal impoverishment and lowering of standards? This is the question that confronts the whole human race, that is becoming a life or death question for the 1,900 million human beings of the capitalist world outside the Soviet Union, to which these hundreds of millions must find the answer or go down in catastrophe. It is evident that what is here in question is no natural or technical cause, but only social causes, that there is no social organization of production. This question is sharpened by the contrast of the productive increase in the Soviet Union, alongside the actual decline of capitalist production. Between 1925 and 1932, industrial production in the Soviet Union, on the base of 1925 to 9 as 100, increased from 59 to 240. The corresponding figure for the United States decreased from 95 to 58, for Britain from 99 to 86, and for Germany from 89 to 66, according to the League of Nations World Production and Prices, 1925 to 1932. Between 1929 and 1932, industrial production in the Soviet Union increased by 65%, and in the capitalist world as a whole, decreased by 37%. The most glaring and direct living expression of this present stage of the contradiction between the growth of the productive forces in existing society is the spread of mass unemployment throughout the capitalist world, already before the onset of the world economic crisis, and reaching a total at the height of the world economic crisis, in 1932, according to official figures, of 30 million, and according to unofficial figures, 50 million. Britain, the oldest capitalist country, and the most advanced in decay, first reached this basis of permanent mass unemployment. This situation revealed itself in the winter of 1920 to 21, and has continued up to the present without a break. In the beginning of 1933, the Chancellor of the Exchequer staggered the House of Commons by announcing that he counted on the continuance of such mass unemployment for the next 10 years. The other countries in the succeeding years reached a similar and even more extreme basis, running at the highest point to 8 million in Germany and 14 million in the United States. Unemployment at a certain level has always been present in capitalism. The development of production in capitalist conditions has always displaced workers and independent producers, and thus created the Industrial Reserve Army, which was indispensable to meet the fluctuations of capitalist production and to maintain the proletariat in subjection. But this Industrial Reserve Army was a part of the machinery of expanding capitalist production. The absolute number of productive workers employed successively grew. So quick comment here. What he's saying is that unemployment is a standard feature of capitalism, even the progressive, rising capitalism that is throwing off feudalism and constructing that new capitalist society. That pool, which always existed, having different individuals in it, but always existed of a certain percentage of unemployed workers, helped to meet capitalist production, which would reallocate people to different branches of industry, and did so in a way that kept workers off balance and unable to politically resist what was going on very effectively. I say politically, but also this was used to break industrial actions and strikes. So that was even in the best of times when capitalism had a historically progressive function. But at this point, when it becomes imperialism and starts to stagnate, its advanced monopoly capitalism, there is this new phenomenon of just mass permanent unemployment. Those old enough to remember 2008 to like 2010, 2011, 2012 probably remember people I knew a few people who were unemployed for like 2 years straight. You remember there was a big political debate about extending the unemployment to 99 weeks and what were you going to do after that. So, yeah. Continuing, it is only since the war that the new phenomenon appeared of a permanent unemployed army. grudgingly kept just alive at the lowest level of subsistence by the bourgeoisie, while the absolute number of productive workers employed has directly decreased. Of the possibility of such a stage of chronic unemployment and absolute decline of the productive workers, Marx wrote in Capital Volume 3, quote, "A development of the productive forces which would diminish the absolute number of laborers, that is, which would enable the entire nation to accomplish its total production in a shorter time, would cause a revolution because it would render the majority of the population superfluous," unquote. So comment, in an economy where you got to work to eat, you have to sell your labor to get the wages that you use to buy all of the commodified essentials of life. Well, if the productive forces get to a level of productivity where just people don't need to work anymore, that whole work to eat, work for a wage to get the necessities of life thing, that starts to break down. We're definitely in that period now. We were already entering it in the 1930s. We're definitely in it now. Continuing, Engels wrote in 1886, quote, "America will smash up England's industrial monopoly, whatever there is left of it, but America cannot herself succeed to that monopoly. And unless one country has the monopoly of the markets of the world, at least in the decisive branches of trade, the conditions, relatively favorable, which existed here in England from 1848 to 1870, cannot anywhere be reproduced, and even in America the condition of the working class must gradually sink lower and lower. For if there are three countries, say England, America, and Germany, competing on comparatively equal terms for the possession of the world market, there is no chance but chronic overproduction, one of the three being capable of supplying the whole quantity required," unquote. Today, we're face to face with the situation. The position in America is reported as follows by H.B. Butler in the International Labor Review, March 1931. Quote, "The United States Commissioner for Labor Statistics recently stated that if 200 out of the 1,357 boot and shoe factories in the country worked full-time, they could satisfy the whole existing demand, and the remaining 1,157 establishments could be closed down. Similarly, 1,487 out of the 6,057 bituminous coal mines could produce all the coal that was needed," unquote. Between 1919 and 1927, factory output in the United States rose from 147 to 170 if we consider 1914 as 100, while the employment index fell from 129 to 115. Between 1919 and 1929, the Federal Reserve Board Index of Industrial Production, setting the years 1923 to 5 as 100, rose from 84 to 119, while the number of industrial wage workers fell from 9,039,000 to 8,742,000. This absolute decline in employment was before the collapse, during the Great Upward Boom. Britain reveals a similar picture. Between 1913 and 1928, the increase in output per head of workers employed in 30 principal industries in Great Britain was 33%, but the increase in employment was 2.2%, or less than the increase in population. Still more marked is the process if the post-war period is taken alone. Between 1923 and 1928, the number of insured workers in employment fell from 8,368,000 to 7,898,000. The index of production rose from 88.7 to 96.3. Production rose 7.6%. Employment fell 5.6%. And all this before the World Economic Crisis or Great Depression began to make the heaviest effects of the process felt. What is to happen to the superfluous workers? For long, the old theory of alternative employment was still endeavored to be put forward as applicable to this situation. The decline in the industrial productive workers was to be compensated by the increase of auxiliary services and luxury occupations, clerical, distributive, advertising, commercial, and luxury services. Certainly, a very considerable increase in these auxiliary and in the main non-productive occupations is to be traced in the United States, Britain, and the other countries during the post-war period, thus providing the basis of the rapid expansion of the so-called new middle class, which became one of the breeding grounds of fascism, just as the growth of the permanent unemployed army provided a further breeding ground. The expansion of the rentier class on the one side, and of luxury services and endlessly multiplied salesmanship services on the other, is a measure of the degeneration of capitalism. Quoting Marx's Capital, Volume 1, the capitalist mode of production, while on the one hand enforcing economy in each individual business, on the other hand begets by its anarchical system of competition the most outrageous squandering of labor power and of the social means of production, not to mention the creation of a vast number of employments at present indispensable, but in themselves superfluous." Unquote. Nevertheless, this supposed compensation was soon revealed as a doubtful solution. In the first place, it was manifestly no solution for the millions of miners and heavy industry workers thrown out of work. In the second place, the extent of compensation had obvious limits which were soon reached. For in these occupations, too, rationalization begins to get to work and to repeat the process of throwing off these superfluous workers. Comment: so basically, they create all of these service jobs kind of just to keep people busy because industry is getting so productive that fewer and fewer workers are needed. But they can't just have, 20% of the population unemployed or more. That's going to be a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands, a lot of social disruption, people not able to pay their bills, provide for their dependents. And those people are going to end up joining revolutionary socialist outfits. So you get kind of make-work stuff. People are used to thinking of make-work as kind of like, digging a ditch and filling it back in again. Stuff to just kind of keep people occupied, which is somewhat useful, but mainly it's to keep people, out of trouble, quote unquote. But even these service jobs that they came up with to keep people working, rather than becoming socialists and whatnot, even there, the capitalist competitive processes and the increase of productivity and all of that starts to throw those people out of work. So truly, they just cannot help themselves. This is how this process goes, and it only ends up in one place. Continuing, mechanization transforms clerical work and begins increasingly to replace clerks by more and more elaborate calculating and bookkeeping machines. Centralization cuts down the number of competing businesses. Staffs are reduced. The white-collar workers also find themselves increasingly thrown on the market alongside their industrial brothers. Increasing doubts of the whole process and its outcome, as well as of the stock explanations and solutions, found expression in an editorial of the London Times in 1930 on, quote, American unemployment, characteristically endeavoring to treat the problem as an American problem, but in fact describing equally the unemployment that was in Britain. Quote, "It is difficult to avoid the conclusion that unemployment must henceforth be counted as a permanent American problem. To ascribe its occasional recurrence in an acute form to some special event is no less delusive than to explain it as a merely seasonal manifestation. The experience of recent years has gone to prove that recovery is less and less complete after each crisis, and to show that forces other than the seasonal and the accidental are at work. There is little reason to doubt that permanent unemployment is today the lot of an always growing number of American men and women," unquote. On this basis, doubt is expressed of the whole system of mass production, i.e. of capitalist large-scale production. Quote, "The advantages residing in a system which relies on the mass production of standardized articles deserve more critical examination than they have yet been given," unquote. Well, I guess it depends on who you ask, because certainly that critical examination has been going on in some quarters. Continuing, "The current answers of the apologists of the system, that the reduced costs of production and therefore reduced price means increased demand and consequent reabsorption of the unemployed, are, quote, no longer altogether convincing." Continuing the quote, "It is still doubtful whether the increased production can always be absorbed. It is a very large question whether new industries are created quickly enough to employ the displaced workers. In other words, it remains to be seen how perilously the machine has run ahead of man, and whether some readjustment of social condition may not ultimately be imperative. The question drives like rain to the roots of American, wink wink, life," unquote. Under the thin disguise of America, it is obvious that the question drives like rain to the roots of capitalism in all countries, and not least in Britain, with its longest record of permanent mass unemployment. Another comment here, I find all this really fascinating and a good explanation. I think when he was talking before, I just don't want to get too far ahead of it, about the breeding grounds of fascism. He's identified two so far. The one is the growing permanent unemployed army who are going to call out for solutions, and if they are blocked in terms of having anti-communist thinking, like that's the only real way forward, but if they've been convinced that communism, Marxism is not the answer, then they're going to end up crying out for fascism. not understanding that it's really just capitalism with a little bit of sort of quasi-revolutionary dressing. The reality is that technology has made the old social forms obsolete. And, people, I think it's hard sometimes for people of more limited imagination, by which I mean even just average imagination. We're living in pretty incredible times, and for a lot of people, it's a lot to process that we would have an entirely new way of life where the family as we knew it is no longer a necessity, where science is replacing the basis of religion by giving people actual knowledge, even to enormous questions, and where just getting up and working 8 or 10 hours a day is just not a thing you have to do anymore. But I think for a lot of people who are very indoctrinated into the system and very dependent on its assumptions, the assumptions that it has taught them and socialized them into, some of these possibilities are actually experienced with anxiety rather than a sense of freedom. And so people end up clinging to and demanding and calling for these obsolete social formations. And to maintain the illusion that these things are at all justifiable and not actually just a sort of form of weakness or limitation of imagination, inability to adapt to changing technological conditions, they wind up clinging to a social system, an overall, catch-all social system, capitalism, and all of the institutions that are associated with it. They wind up clinging to that and trying to maintain it against all reason, and this causes enormous conflict. The other breeding ground of fascism is the rapid expansion of the so-called new middle class. And there's a post I think about constantly, which was about a neighborhood that had a homeowners association, which some of these things can be very restrictive and tyrannical. There was a neighborhood that had a homeowners association, but there was like one house that was not part of it for some reason or another. And they let their grass grow really high, and they left their trash cans out at the end of their driveway. And some other person that was in the homeowners association and was completely bent out of shape that their neighbor was not maintaining similar standards with their property went on this huge thing on social media, absolutely freaking out about it. And the post was just the rage that these freaks feel when someone's grass is, not the right height, etc., is the core of American fascism. That section reminded me of that. All right, continuing. What prevents capitalism from carrying out the alternative solution universally proposed by all the myriad schools of reformers of capitalism? That is, reformist socialists, social credit theorists, currency reformers, etc. That is, the general raising of the standards of the workers to a point compatible with the consumption of the increased production alongside higher profits for the capitalists. The answer why capitalism is unable to carry out this apparently simple solution, in other words, you wouldn't have overproduction crises if you were paying the workers enough to just consume all the stuff, lies in the whole character of capitalism. It is in fact actively engaged in carrying out the opposite. The reformist dream of grafting onto the capitalist mode of production an entirely different and incompatible system of distribution, whether by legislative means, raising wages, social services, a quote, national dividend, or the like, only reveals its advocates' failure to understand the elementary workings of capitalism and the necessary conditions of the capitalist mode of production. The reformists apply in their fantasy the conceptions of an organized society directly to the jungle of capitalism, which, by the very conditions of private property and production for profit, cannot follow the principles of an organized economy, but can only follow entirely different laws. In fact, even the very limited measure of social reform which could be achieved under the pressure of the working class in the conditions of ascending capitalism become increasingly circumscribed and even in part diminished and withdrawn in the conditions of declining capitalism and of the capitalist crisis. The realities of capitalism are both in fact and in iron necessity entirely different. The greater the crisis, the greater becomes the need of the rival capitalist concerns to lower the costs of production. Remember, wages are one of those. To increase the rate of exploitation, to drive the dwindling number of employed workers harder, to attack the workers' standards and the social services in order to compete more successfully for the dwindling market. And comment here, in the 1930s, actually the same year, you got the beginnings of the New Deal, and this was kind of the beginning of the social democratic period in the advanced capitalist countries. However, what happened is, after the general crisis of the 1970s, They came in the 80s with the neoliberal push to completely dismantle that whole system, which had only been around for a few decades. See the recent community post we did on the falling rate of profit, which shows that the rate of profit precipitously fell during the 70s and led to that neoliberal political counter-revolution. Reaganism, Thatcherism, neoliberalism, but basically this whole anti-welfare state thing to go into just austerity and the death of 1,000 cuts, defunding of public programs, privatization, deregulation, then later the war on terror, the intense drive to open the Middle East to greater exploitation, Middle East and Central Asia, and so on. We're now several decades into that, and it's getting incredibly intense. Continuing. At the same time, the growth of unemployment facilitates these attacks. The development of the crisis has been accompanied in every country by successively renewed and intensified attacks on the workers' standards. The authentic voice of capitalism is the voice of the American capitalist magnate, Owen D. Young, the sponsor of the Young Plan, when he declared, quote, "Let no man think that the living standards of America can be permanently maintained at a measurably higher level than those of the other civilized countries," unquote. The Roosevelt experiment, which has skillfully utilized the reformist propaganda of higher standards as the solution of the capitalist crisis, but utilized it in fact for the exactly opposite purpose, to carry through intensified exploitation and lowered standards, just as President Wilson of old utilized pacifist propaganda for the purposes of war, is proving in practice, as we shall later have occasion to see, only a more complete demonstration of this reality. The growth of productivity has been accompanied not by an increase of the workers' share, but by a decrease of the workers' share. Between 1913 and 1928, the percentages of the national income going to wages fell in the United States, from 36.4 to 36, and in the UK, from 42.7 to 40.9. In the United States, between 1921 and 1927, the value of the product of industry rose from $18.3 thousand million to $27.5 thousand million. But in the same period, the percentages of the value of the product of industry going to wages and salaries fell from 58.7% in 1921 to 54.2% in 1914 to 51% in 1927. In Great Britain, between 1924 and 1930, according to Colin Clark's The National Income 1924 to 31, the output per person employed rose from 100 to 113, while the proportion of wages to home-produced income fell from 41.5% to 38%. The effect of the world economic crisis has been, not to reverse this process, but to carry it enormously further forward. The drive to rationalization, to speeding up, to extracting a still higher output per worker for less return, has been intensified under the conditions of the crisis. Between 1929 and 1932, the output per man-hour has actually been forced up by 12% in the United States, alongside 12 million unemployed. Quoting The Economist, May 5, 1933, labor costs per unit of output have been substantially reduced by an improvement in productive efficiency. The output per man-hour in the United States increased by about 12% between 1929 and 1932, unquote. It is obvious that the effect of this is still further to intensify the contradiction which already led to the economic crisis. In the face of these facts, increasing doubts begin to assail the capitalists, whether there can ever be full-scale employment again, even if the extreme intensity of the crisis of 1929 to 33 should give place to a considerable upward movement. Thus, it is reported from America, quoting the Washington correspondent of the London Times, November 1932, American employment reached its highest point in 1918, American production in 1929, and it is carefully and accurately computable today that if by some magic a return could be made to the productive maximum of 3 years ago, there would still be no work for 45% of the present 12 million unemployed, unquote. From Britain comes the same tale. Quoting the Times Trade Supplement, July 1932, if the 2.5 million of unemployed were absorbed in factory occupations, the national output of manufactured articles would be on such a scale that the available buying markets would be inadequate to absorb it. Hence, if such a method of labor absorption could and did take place, it would only precipitate a new crisis, unquote. Such are the alternatives which begin to be seen by the capitalists, even if the present crisis should give place to the most extensive upward movement. Either continued mass unemployment of millions, even if, by some magic, the record level of the previous production boom could be attained, or if all the unemployed are absorbed into productive labor, then inevitably the immediate precipitation of a new crisis. As this new situation begins to be realized, the beckoning phantom of a new world war is the only, quote, solution to utilize the productive forces and wipe off the, quote, superfluous population begins to exercise a visibly increasing attraction on capitalist thought and policy as the final gamble. Comment. So what he's saying here is that as capitalism got into deep crisis, they needed to A, utilize the productive forces, and B, do something with the mass amounts of unemployed people. Well, to B, they could kill them off in a war. This is destruction of surplus labor. And also for A, war requires vehicles, armaments, and all kinds of other supplies. So not only would another world war accomplish those two aims, it would also give the imperialists another crack at competing to redivide the world. Continuing. Nearly a century ago, Engels wrote of the necessary consequences of the inevitable future breakdown of the British capitalist monopoly, writing in The Condition of the Working Class in England in 1844, quote, "Should English manufactures be thus vanquished, the majority of the proletariat must become forever superfluous and has no other choice than to starve or to rebel," unquote. In 1932, 87 years later, the British Prime Minister spoke in the House of Commons of the prospect, even if trade should recover and prosperity return, of having to find, quote, "great bodies of men and women, perhaps even amounting to a couple of millions, to be, to all intents and purposes, in our society, superfluous scrap." That was J.R. MacDonald in the House of Commons, November 22, 1932. In 1933, the leader of British conservatism had to make the same melancholy admission, quote, "There is the great core of unemployment. We do not know what the numbers may be. There may be 1 million, 1.5 million, or less than 1 million, but there will be a vast number for whom there is but little hope of employment being found in this country. The gates of migration are closed against us. What can we do? That is a problem that has baffled the country completely up to now." Oh, has it? That was Stanley Baldwin in the House of Commons, November 27, 1933. What can we do? This is the final answer of what was once the most powerful capitalism in the world, when faced today with the problem of millions who seek only to work and live. Comment here, do you hear the early stirrings of the kinds of thinking that led to the death camps in Nazi Germany? Continuing, there could be no sharper expression of the bankruptcy of capitalism than when, in the midst of wealth and unexampled productive power, it can no longer even find the means to exploit a growing proportion of its slaves, and is compelled to proclaim millions of human beings, living, strong, and able and willing to labor, as superfluous scrap. The time draws close for the second half of the alternative, to rebel, as the only solution for the extending millions of producers cut off from production, no less than for the millions whose growing output is accompanied by growing poverty. 4. The alternative, social revolution or destruction. The alternatives which confront society at the present stage are thus clear. Capital can no longer utilize the productive forces. Capital can no longer utilize the full labor power of the productive population. Monopoly capitalism is more and more visibly choking the whole organization of production and exchange. The working masses can no longer find even the former limited conditions of existence within the conditions of capitalism. Increasing millions are thrown aside as superfluous. The standards of all are successively attacked. Intensification of labor of the dwindling numbers employed is accompanied by worsening of standards. The class struggle grows more intense. New forms of widening mass struggle develop. New and intenser methods of repression and coercion are brought into play by the ruling class. Against this situation, the knowledge and understanding, which begins to grow more and more widely spread, of the scientific and technical possibilities of unlimited production and abundance for all, confronts existing society like a mockery and a torment, creating on the one side, among a growing section of the dispossessed, revolutionary anger and determination, creating on the other side, among the doomed possessing classes, growing desperation and recklessness, the revolt against science, the revolt against mechanical technique, and readiness to embark on ever more frenzied courses of destruction. Two alternatives, and only two, confront existing society at the present stage of development of the productive forces and of social organization. One is to throttle the development of the productive forces in order to save class society, to destroy material wealth, to destroy millions of, quote, superfluous human beings in the slow rot of starvation and the quick furnace of war, to crush down the working class movement with limitless violence, to arrest the development of science and culture and education, and to turn to ever more destructive war as the supreme aim of each imperialist bloc striving to find a way out for itself at the expense of its rivals, and thus to seek to save for a while the rule of the possessing classes at the expense of a return to barbarism and spreading decay. This is the path which finds its most complete and most organized expression in fascism. The other is to organize the productive forces for the whole society by abolishing the class ownership of the means of production and building up the classless communist society, which can alone utilize and organize the modern productive forces. This is the path of communism, of the revolutionary working class. The issue of these two paths is the issue of the present epoch. It is to the former of these two alternatives that the existing capitalist world is today moving at an increasing pace, and to which it will more and more visibly develop in the period ahead, if the revolutionary working class does not succeed in time in saving the whole future of civilization and of human culture.